Chapter 1. Beneath the Canopy of the Gods. Before temples rose from stone and kings carved their names into eternity, there was only the land. In the heart of Southeast Asia, nestled between the curves of winding rivers and the shadow of far-off mountains, lay a realm shrouded in mystery. The land we now call Cambodia was once a boundless green sea, a vast and ancient forest where the world whispered in leaves and the sky filtered softly through endless canopies. Here nature spoke like a god, the great Mekong River, gliding like a silver serpent through the landscape, nourished the soil and gave life to all who settled near it. Its seasonal floods were not feared. They were welcomed, revered. In its rhythm, people saw the pulse of the divine. Water was not merely water. It was a living spirit, a sacred offering. The land, too, was not just land. Hills were believed to be the backs of sleeping dragons. Caverns echoed with the breath of ancestors. The forests were not silent. They were filled with voices, spirits of the trees, gods of the harvest, guardians of stone. Even before the rise of cities, the people who lived in this place, fishermen, farmers, craftsmen, held deep reverence for the natural world around them. Their lives moved slowly with the seasons. They watched the stars and listened to the birds. They sang to the rain and whispered to the wind. In every stone and stream they saw something eternal, and in the quiet hush of dusk, when the last light dipped behind the jungle canopy, they told stories, stories of creation, of gods who shaped mountains and rivers with their hands, and of a kingdom that would one day rise from the heart of this sacred land. It was here, beneath the green embrace of the ancient jungle, that the Khmer spirit was born. Not yet an empire, but already something vast. The influence of Indian civilization. Long before armies marched and temples soared into the sky, the world began to change, gently, like a breeze rolling over calm water. From distant shores, Indian sailors and traders began arriving at the coastlines of Southeast Asia. They brought more than spices and fabrics. They brought stories, scriptures, beliefs, and ideas that would slowly weave themselves into the soul of the land. The people of early Cambodia, curious and open-hearted, did not resist these new ways. They welcomed them like rainfall after drought, and with time, the sacred waters of Indian culture flowed gently into the soil of the Khmer. Hinduism arrived, not as a conqueror, but as a guest, entering quietly through merchants and missionaries. Its myths spoke of powerful gods, Shiva, the destroyer and creator, Vishnu, the preserver of worlds, Brahma, the divine architect. These were stories that mirrored the Khmer's own beliefs, of life being born from nature, of gods who lived not far above, but here within the world. Buddhism followed closely behind. Its gentle path, one of peace, compassion, and mindfulness, found resonance in a land where people already listened closely to the forest and the river. Alongside these spiritual gifts came language, the sacred scripts of Sanskrit and Pali. With writing came history, memory, and the ability to inscribe stories into stone. Art too began to bloom. Sculptures of gods with many arms, carvings of dancing spirits, and the first sacred architecture that would one day blossom into wonders like Angkor Wat. But this was only the beginning, a quiet unfolding. The Khmer were not simply imitators, they were artists of synthesis. They took the stories of India and made them their own, painting them in the colors of their land, infusing them with the rhythm of their rivers, and carving them into their own sacred mountains. Thus, the soul of an empire began to stir, shaped not only by its native roots, but by winds that had travelled across oceans. The rise of Funan and Chenla. Before the Khmer Empire, there were whispers of power, smaller kingdoms rising and falling like the tide. The first of these was Funan, a kingdom that thrived in the lowlands near the coast, likely as early as the 1st century CE. Its capital, known to Chinese travellers, was a hub of trade and diplomacy. Merchants came from India, China, and even Rome, drawn to its wealth and openness. Funan was not a warlike state. It grew through commerce, through culture, through quiet confidence. Funan's kings, said to be wise and pious, began to adopt Indian traditions. They performed Vedic rituals, built sanctuaries, and called themselves Chakravartin, universal rulers. But they were Khmer at heart. Their cities rose not from desert or stone, but from waterlogged plains and jungle clearings. They were builders of canals as much as temples, engineers of flood and field. As centuries passed, Funan gave way to Chenla, a collection of inland kingdoms nestled deeper in the forests and valleys. Chenla was wilder, more rugged. Its rulers carved their names into mountain walls and raised sanctuaries in remote hills. They worshipped both Hindu and indigenous gods, and their art became bolder, more Khmer in style, more confident in form. Chenla was not one kingdom, but many, sometimes united, often divided. And yet, through these centuries of change, a single thread remained. The people of the land were learning to rule, to build, to dream beyond village and valley. And somewhere in the heart of these fragmented realms, the seed of a greater power was quietly taking root. Whispers of a kingdom to come. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the forests began to grow quiet, not in silence, but in waiting. Something was shifting. The wind carried rumors of a new kind of leader. The rivers moved as if guided by unseen hands. And in distant clearings, men began to carve temples not just for gods, but for memory. In the ancient region of Mahendraparvata, the mountain of the great Indra, early kings began to shape something new. They did not seek only power, but permanence. They built reservoirs that held the sky's reflection. They traced canals that turned flood into blessing. They carved mountains into monuments. These rulers, like Jayavarman VII and the Two, were more than kings. They were symbols of unification. Jayavarman II, in particular, would later be remembered not just as a sovereign, but as the founder of something eternal. From the sacred mountain of Phnom Kulen, he declared himself a Devaraja, a god-king, an idea that would echo through Khmer history for centuries. But in this early moment, it was still a whisper, a breath in the jungle, a stirring in the earth. No one yet knew what would come. No one could yet see the spires of Angkor rising into the sky. But something had begun. Beneath the canopy of the gods, in the land of river and rain, a kingdom was awakening. Slowly, patiently, powerfully. And the world would never be the same again. Chapter 2. The Birth of an Empire. Jayavarman VII. In the misty shadows of history, where myth and memory blur like morning fog over the rice fields, a boy was born. His name would one day echo across temples and rivers. But in the beginning, he was only a prince, unproven, unremembered, and exiled. Jayavarman VII came into the world during a time of great uncertainty. The kingdoms of Southeast Asia were in flux. Chenla, once powerful, had splintered into competing realms, some coastal, some inland, all fragile. No single ruler held the whole of the land. And into this world of fractured power, the young Jayavarman disappeared. What happened next is not fully known. Historians whisper of Java, the island far across the sea, where Indianized courts rose with golden towers and kings ruled by divine law. Some believe Jayavarman was taken there as a political hostage. Others suggest he sought shelter or even education among the Javanese elite. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: Java changed him. In Java he would have seen a world where the king was not merely a man, but a symbol, a divine link between heaven and earth. He would have learned the rituals of statecraft, the philosophies of power, and the meaning of sacred rule. These lessons, once planted, would never leave him. By the time Jayavarman returned to his homeland, he was no longer a wandering prince. He was a man with a vision that would change the course of history. Return to the homeland. The Cambodia Jayavarman returned to was a land without a center. It was the early 800s. Across the plains and forests, power was scattered like fallen leaves. Local rulers governed their own corners of the world, some in the name of old Chenla, others claiming new titles. The land was fertile, the rivers abundant, but unity was missing. There was no empire, no single banner flying above the hills. Jayavarman stepped into this fragmented world with quiet intent. He did not arrive as a conqueror, not at first. He settled in the region of Indrapura in southeastern Cambodia near today's Kampong Cham. From there he began to gather followers, nobles who saw in him something different, priests who sensed destiny, warriors who recognized purpose. But he was not the only one with ambition. Rival kings and warlords ruled from different parts of the land, Sambupura, Bhavapura, and other forgotten capitals. Jayavarman's path was not clear, nor was it smooth. He moved carefully. He forged alliances. He offered gifts. He fought when he had to. Slowly, he began to absorb rival domains, either through diplomacy or strength. Step by step, the patchwork of provinces began to stitch itself into a tapestry. And always there was something larger in his mind. Not just rule, but renewal. Not just power, but permanence. Jayavarman was building something more than a kingdom. He was preparing the soul of an empire. The mountain ceremony Devaraya, at the summit of a sacred mountain where the clouds kissed the forest and the wind carried the scent of rain and incense, Jayavarman stood still. It was the year 802 B. The place was Phnom Kulen, a ridge rising in the north like the spine of a sleeping god. Here, in a clearing hidden by jungle and mist, the king performed a ceremony that would shape the destiny of his people. He did not stand alone. Beside him was a Brahmin priest, likely named Hiranyadama, who carried with him the wisdom of ancient texts and the rituals of faraway lands. Around them were nobles, warriors, and monks gathered in solemn silence. The air was thick with meaning. Jayavarman was not merely proclaiming himself king. That had already been done. What he was about to do was something far deeper, something spiritual. In the language of the gods, in the rhythm of sacred chants, Jayavarman declared himself a Devaraja, a god-king. The mounting ceremony was not political theatre. It was a binding, a moment where the king became the earthly incarnation of Shiva, the great god of creation and destruction. By this act, Jayavarman claimed more than territory. He claimed cosmic legitimacy. His right to rule was no longer granted by lineage or conquest. It flowed from the heavens. The ritual placed a divine linga, a sacred stone symbol of Shiva, at the center of his realm. This linga was not just an object. It was the spiritual heart of the empire, a symbol of order, unity, and divine protection. Wherever it stood, there stood the center of the world. From this moment onward, kings of the Khmer would not simply rule, they would embody the divine. Their authority would be sacred, their temples would be palaces of gods, and their cities reflections of heaven. Atop Phnom Kulen, beneath the canopy of trees and sky, the Khmer Empire was born, not with swords, but with silence and ceremony. The unification of lands. After the mountain ceremony, Jayavarman's path became clearer, but no easier. The idea of divine kingship gave him authority, but not automatic obedience. Many lords still held their own fiefdoms, and the old rivalries of Chenla did not vanish overnight. The dream of unity required more than ritual. It required action. Jayavarman moved steadily, like the flow of a river wearing down stone. He launched campaigns not of wild conquest, but of calculated strength. He fought battles where needed, but he also married wisely, gifted generously, and built alliances that would hold. He moved his capital northward into the region of Mahendra Parvata, close to the sacred mountain. This was symbolic as much as strategic. He was rooting his power in the divine, building his throne not in trade cities, but in the heart of the forest, close to the gods. Temples began to rise. Small at first, simple sanctuaries of stone and spirit. They marked the land like stars, each one a sign that the king's vision was taking shape. More importantly, infrastructure grew. Reservoirs, roads, and canals began to appear, not yet at the scale of Angkor, but enough to knit the territories together. These were not just practical feats, they were acts of permanence, declarations that this new realm was here to stay. Jayavarman's empire was still young, still vulnerable, but it was real. By the time of his death, sometime around the mid-800s, he had done what no one before him had achieved. He had taken a broken land and given it a center. He had taken scattered peoples and given them a story. He had taken his own exile, his own journey, and turned it into the foundation of one of the greatest civilizations the world would ever know. And in the years to come, the Khmer would build upon that foundation. Stone by stone, temple by temple, age by age. Chapter 3. Foundations of Glory, Hariharalaya. Not far from the shores of the great Tonle Sap Lake, where the water expands and retreats with the rhythm of the seasons, there once rose a city of quiet purpose and divine intent. Hariharalaya, its name whispered a sacred union, Hari for Vishnu, the preserver of the universe, and Hara for Shiva, the lord of destruction and rebirth. In this name alone, one could feel the weight of balance, of opposites joined in cosmic harmony. This was no ordinary settlement. It was a city conceived not just by kings but by gods. Nestled within the rich plains of the lower Roluos region, the city grew from the dreams of Jayavarman II and his successors. This was the first true capital of the Khmer Empire, the place where vision began to harden into stone and empire started to take shape, brick by careful brick. The Tonle Sap itself played a silent role in this story. Each year, as rains fell across the land, the lake swelled with new life. Its waters surged, its fish multiplied, and its bounty fed a growing people. The rhythm of the lake was sacred, its cycles eternal. Around it cities would rise, but it was Hariharalaya that first aligned itself with the divine pulse of the land. The city was not vast, not yet, but it was alive. Palaces stood modest, temples stood proud, and priests moved like shadows through the courtyards. Canals were carved to redirect the flow of life-giving waters. Reservoirs, or berets, were shaped by hand and vision, reflecting the sky in still silence. Here the rituals of kingship were refined. Here the divine authority of the Devaraja was practiced, repeated, and solidified through sacred ceremony. The city was not just a center of rule, it was the cradle of identity. Every stone, every statue, every aligned axis of temple and sun was a message. The king is sacred, and the land is his divine charge. Hariharalaya was the seed, and in its quiet rise the great forest of empire would one day bloom. Brick and spirit. In the early light of morning, when the mist still hung above the rice fields and the sounds of the waking city were soft, something extraordinary was already underway. Temples, made not of impermanent wood or straw, but of brick, red, fired, enduring. These were the earliest Khmer sanctuaries, and they bore within them the heart of the empire's spirit. In the center of Hariharalaya rose the Preah Ko temple, the sacred bull. Built by King Indravarman V, it stood as an offering of devotion and remembrance. 6 towers stood aligned in neat symmetry, their surfaces carved with intricate motifs and Sanskrit script. They were not tall, they did not yet soar into the heavens like later monuments, but they breathed with purpose, with peace. Not far from Preah Ko came Bakong, the first large mountain temple, shaped like a stepped pyramid, reaching toward the sky like the sacred Mount Meru of Indian mythology. Surrounded by moats and stone lions, Bakong stood as more than architecture. It was a declaration. The Khmer were no longer borrowing ideas. They were shaping them, making them their own. These early temples were built from laterite and brick, their walls once covered in smooth plaster, now long gone. But the bricks remain, small, uniform, made by hand. It is said they were fused, not just with clay but with natural sap and love, no mortar, just knowledge and spirit. Inside these temples, statues of Shiva and Vishnu sat silent but not still. Offerings of flowers, fruit, and flame were made. Chants rose like mist into the air. The divine lived here, close and real. The king did not merely visit. He became part of this sacred geometry. These early temples formed the grammar of Khmer art. They shaped the way light fell on stone, the way gods faced the sun, the way a nation understood beauty. Hariharalaya's temples were not yet the grand marvels of Angkor, but they held the soul of something far older. They were the first breath of what would become a roar, the cult of Shiva and Vishnu. In the heart of Hariharalaya, the gods did not dwell in distant heavens. They were here, in stone, in ceremony, in the mind of the king and the silence of the sanctum. Among these, two divine presences reigned above all, Shiva and Vishnu. To the Khmer, these were not conflicting
gods. They were forces in balance. Shiva, the destroyer and creator, god of mountains, of time, of fire and meditation, and Vishnu, the preserver, protector of order, restorer of justice. Together they shaped the world.
And together they shaped the empire. The cult of Shiva found deep roots here. As Devaraja, the king was seen as the earthly vessel of Shiva, his word sacred, his duty cosmic. The linga, a smooth, vertical stone symbolizing Shiva's presence, was enshrined in nearly every temple. It was an axis, a point of focus, the meeting place of sky and earth. Rituals were performed in silence and shadow, often by torchlight. Water was poured over the linga, flowing down as sacred blessing, but Vishnu too held power. Often seen reclining on the cosmic serpent, dreaming the universe into being, Vishnu stood for continuity, protection, the peace of order. He inspired balance in law, in governance, in daily life. In time, future kings would even come to identify more with Vishnu than Shiva, reshaping the sacred thread of kingship yet again. Yet in Hariharalaya they coexisted. Two gods, one throne, two paths, one empire. This dual devotion reflected a deeper wisdom. The Khmer were not rigid in belief. Their faith was a living thing, shaped by Indian influence, but rooted in local spirit. Naga serpents from native myth curled beside Sanskrit prayers. Mountain gods were married to river queens. Even the ancestors became part of this sacred circle, remembered, honored, worshipped. Through Shiva and Vishnu, the kingdom found a language of power, not harsh, not loud, but firm, eternal, sacred. A kingdom takes shape. With every passing year, the dreams of Jayavarman II grew firmer in the hands of those who followed him, his successors, particularly Indravarman I and his son Yasovarman.
I did not only inherit a kingdom, they inherited a vision.
And in the fertile plains around Hariharalaya, they began to give it shape. Indravarman, Fatsi, builder of Prayako and Bakong, was a ruler of grace and clarity. Under his rule, waterworks expanded. Reservoirs like Indratataka were dug, transforming the seasonal floods into life-sustaining reserves, canals laced through fields, linking farmlands and temples. Agriculture flourished, the capital grew. Brick by brick, stone by stone, order began to form from chaos. Indravarman's son, Yasovarman I, inherited not just his father's throne, but his ambition. It was Yasovarman who would leave Hariharalaya behind, choosing instead to build a new capital on a sacred hill, Phnom Bakeng, near the site that would one day become Angkor. But even in this act of departure, the foundation of Hariharalaya was honored. It had been the womb of empire, and its memory remained sacred. From these beginnings, the Khmer state was no longer just an idea. It was a structure, a system. It had priests and warriors, farmers and builders, artisans and scribes. It had the heartbeat of divine kingship, the bones of architecture, and the breath of faith. Hariharalaya had done what it was meant to do. It had given the empire its first form, its first prayer, its first skyline. It had become the first step in a story that would stretch across centuries, through jungle and stone, through war and wonder. And though the city would one day fall, silent, its spirit would never fade. It would echo in the towers of Angkor Wat. It would hum through the carved galleries of Bayon. It would live in every brick and every prayer that followed. Because in this place, long ago, beneath the rising sun and the swelling lake, a kingdom had begun to dream, and its dream would touch the stars. Chapter 4. Water and Stone, the Power of Infrastructure. In the center of Cambodia, beneath a sky often brushed with golden light, lies a body of water that breathes, the Tonle Sap. It is not just a lake. It is a pulse, a living rhythm. With each season it expands and contracts, swelling like a heart in the rainy months, shrinking gently during the dry. It is one of the most extraordinary freshwater systems on Earth. But for the Khmer it was something more. It was life itself. Each year the Mekong River reverses course, pushing its waters into the Tonle Sap and flooding the surrounding plains. The lake can grow 5 times its normal size, swallowing forests, nourishing the soil, and leaving behind a gift of silt and abundance. Fish spawn in its depths, and millions of them return to the people, a harvest more dependable than any field. For the ancient Khmer, this rhythm of flood and retreat was sacred. It was a calendar, a blessing, a constant miracle. The lake was not feared, it was honored. Around its shores, people settled in stilted homes and floating villages. They built boats, cast nets, and offered prayers. The Tonle Sap fed not only bodies, but beliefs. The Khmer Empire grew in harmony with this lake. Cities rose around it, roads led to it, and temples turned toward its waters. The Tonle Sap was both center and source, the heart of an empire that understood that to rule well one must first listen to the land. Without this lake, there would have been no Khmer Empire. But the Khmer did not simply accept nature's gifts. They studied them, shaped them, and turned the rhythm of the earth into the architecture of power. Berets and canals. If the Tonle Sap was the heart, then the berets, the great reservoirs, were the empire's lungs. Stretching across the landscape like shallow seas, these man-made lakes were among the most ambitious waterworks of the ancient world. They were not decorative. They were not symbolic. They were engines of survival, stability, and statecraft. The Khmer built them with care. Walls of laterite and earth, canals dug by hand, sluices and spillways designed with precision. The most famous, the East Beret and the West Beret, near Angkor, were each more than 5 kilometers long. They could hold millions of cubic meters of water. To walk beside them was to feel the scale of a civilization, not just of stone, but of science. These reservoirs did more than store water. They transformed the floodplain into a grid of life. During the rainy season, they collected overflow. During the dry season, they released their stores through a network of canals that spread like veins across the fields. Rice could be grown more than once a year. Famine became rare. Fields were green long after the skies had emptied. The canals fed the cities too. They allowed for easy transport of goods, stone, timber, and grain. Traders floated to market. Builders shipped sandstone to temple sites, and royal processions glided past lotus-lined banks. The water was not just functional, it was graceful. Some scholars believe the Barrays were also cosmics, that they mirrored the mythical oceans of Hindu cosmology. But even without the symbolism, their purpose was clear: to hold the empire steady, to nourish its people, and to tame the wild swings of nature. What's most remarkable is not just their size, but their subtlety. The Khmer did not build dams like walls. They built systems that danced with the land, absorbing its chaos, channeling its power. And so the Barrays became a kind of quiet strength, an unseen structure beneath the empire's glory. Without them, the stone towers would have meant little, because even kings must eat. Even temples must drink. Temples as hydraulic machines. To walk among the ruins of Angkor is to enter a world of gods and legends. Towering spires, endless carvings, halls of shadow and light. But hidden behind the beauty is something more surprising. These temples were machines, not machines of gears or iron, but of water. They were built as part of the vast hydraulic system that kept the empire alive. Take Angkor Wat, the most famous temple of them all. It is surrounded not just by walls, but by a moat nearly 200 meters wide. To many, it appears ceremonial. But that water was functional, designed to stabilize the temple's foundation, manage runoff during floods, and perhaps even store water for nearby fields. The same is true of the temple mountains of Bayon, Ta Prohm, and Preah Khan. Around each rose a network of moats, dikes, channels, and ponds. These were not random or decorative, they were deliberate. Each temple sat at the center of a managed landscape, positioned to receive, redirect, or discharge water with precise intent. Some temples sat on islands, others floated between moats like lotus flowers in bloom, and all were linked by canals, arteries of a spiritual and agricultural web. The priests performed rituals to bring rain. The engineers built the means to hold it. In this way, sacred space and infrastructure were one. The divine did not live apart from the world. It moved through it. To pray at the temple was to stand within a living system, a system that mirrored the heavens, but also moved mud and fed rice. The Khmer knew that water was power, and they hid that power inside stone, engineering as empire. When we speak of empire, we often speak of armies, crowns, and conquest, but the Khmer Empire was held together by something deeper: the silent strength of engineering. Roads stretched from Angkor like threads of order, linking provinces and outposts. They were straight, raised, and paved with laterite. Alongside them stood rest houses, shrines, and shade trees, a network of care for traders, monks, messengers, and soldiers. Bridges were built from sandstone blocks resting on foundations that still hold today. Carvings of serpents and gods lined their rails, reminders that the physical journey was always also a sacred one. But it was the water system that defined the empire's genius. This was a civilization that saw not just the land, but the flow beneath it. They measured gradients with tools lost to time. They surveyed slopes, redirected rivers, balanced reservoirs. Every palace, every field, every sanctuary, all of them were part of a unified design. This mastery of the landscape gave the Khmer more than abundance. It gave them control. The king who ruled the water ruled the realm. To provide rice in the dry season, to prevent flood in the wet, to bless the fields and fill the canals. This was to command not just the people, but the gods. And so, engineering became authority. This authority was not loud, it was not always visible, but it was everywhere. In the steady harvest, in the clean streets of Angkor Thom, in the cool shade of a traveller's pond. When the empire was at its peak, millions of people were sustained by this system, not just ruled, but supported. The glory of Angkor was not only in its carvings, but in the quiet assurance that the water would come, the rice would grow, and the world would hold together. It is easy to marvel at the temples, but beneath them lies something greater, the knowledge that made them possible. In the end, the Khmer Empire was built not only from ambition or belief, but from water and stone, shaped by hands that understood the land and minds that saw beyond the horizon. Chapter 5. The Age of Ambition. Jayavarman I. In the quiet hush before dawn, when the forests were still and the air hung heavy with mist, a decision was made that would echo through the ages. Jayavarman VII, son of Indravarman Jaya, stood upon the land and looked beyond its boundaries. He saw not what was, but what could be. And from that vision, a city was born. Hariharalaya had been the heart of the early Khmer Empire, sacred, foundational. But to Jayavarman it was only the beginning. The future, he believed, belonged to a grander space, a land where water and earth embraced, where the mountains offered guidance, and where the gods would find a new home on earth. He chose a site just north of the old capital, near the great Tonle Sap. It was fertile, strategic, vast. Here he would plant the seeds of something far greater, and he gave it a name filled with promise, Yashodarapura, the city that bears glory. It was not built in haste, it rose in rhythm, shaped by thought, stone, and spirit. Reservoirs were carved into the earth. Roads stretched outward, like careful brushstrokes. The grid of canals and moats began to take form, the first signs of what would one day become the sprawling wonder of Angkor. Temples soon followed. Shrines and sanctuaries stood not as decoration, but as anchors of power. They marked sacred geometry. They aligned with stars. They reminded all who approached. This was not just a capital, it was a symbol. Yashodarapura was more than a city. It was the dream of order made real through hands, tools, and time. It marked a shift from a fledgling kingdom to a rising empire, and Jayavarman stood at its center, both ruler and builder, mind and spirit of its becoming. Temples of the sky. From the plain below, it seemed to rise from the forest like a sacred mountain, steady, silent, crowned by the sky. Phnom Bakeng. It was Jayavarman's masterpiece, the first great temple mountain of the Angkor region. Built upon a natural hill, it was not meant to hide in the landscape, but to shape it. To climb its steps was to ascend toward heaven. To stand at its summit was to see the future. The temple itself was more than structure. It was a vision in stone 5 levels rose in careful symmetry, each one echoing the cosmic mountain Meru, the center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. At the top, a central sanctuary stood firm, surrounded by smaller towers. Each corner held meaning. Each stairway led not only upward, but inward, toward the divine. Phnom Bakheng was not alone. Yasovarman commissioned more temples, each placed with intention, each facing the cardinal directions. Eastern Barai shimmered nearby, reflecting the sky in its calm waters. On the eastern bank rose temples like Lole and Phnom Krom, each anchoring the land with sacred presence. His temples were often built of sandstone and laterite, durable, earthy, eternal. Their carvings were clean, their towers focused. Unlike the denser, more ornate styles of later centuries, these structures were clear, open, filled with breath. Yasovarman did not build for grandeur alone. He built for alignment, for balance. His temples reached toward the heavens, but they were grounded in soil. They brought the sacred into the world, not through height, but through harmony. They stood as bridges between gods and people, places where the infinite met the finite, where stone became spirit, ascetic king, lavish empire. Yasovarman was a man of paradox. By all accounts, he lived like a sage, an ascetic, a scholar, a man drawn to silence more than celebration. He studied scriptures, he practiced meditation. He sought wisdom in retreat and clarity in ritual. In many ways, he was closer to a forest hermit than a royal prince. And yet, around him, an empire blossomed in scale and splendor. While he may have walked barefoot through temple corridors, his empire marched across provinces. He commissioned
massive works of infrastructure like canals, embankments, reservoirs.
The East Baray, one of the largest water reservoirs in history, was begun under his reign. Its scale was vast, 7 kilometers long, nearly 2 kilometers wide. It held the sky itself in its mirror. Cities grew under his guidance. Monasteries multiplied, roads stretched to the far edges of the realm. Artisans thrived. Agriculture expanded. He also held firm authority. He suppressed rebellions. He demanded order. His word shaped policies. His vision shaped provinces. To the people he was both wise and mighty, a king who ruled not just with power, but with discipline. He did not need to shout. His silence carried weight. His stillness guided motion. This dual life of inner quiet and outward grandeur was not contradiction. It was design. Yasovarman believed that the soul of a kingdom must be rooted in stillness, and its strength must grow from discipline. He left no golden robes or lavish feasts in record, but he left a city, a plan, a way of seeing that would guide generations. He ruled with the soul of a monk and the mind of a builder. And in that rare union, the Khmer Empire found its early identity, one that reached for the sacred, even as it laid stones upon the earth. Legacy in sandstone and soil when Yasovarman. I passed from the world. The forest did not fall silent. His temples still stood, their steps worn but steady. His reservoirs still held the waters of the monsoon. His city still pulsed with quiet purpose. His was not the legacy of a conqueror. He left no trail of ruined cities or tales of burning battlefields. His was the legacy of a maker, a shaper of places and meanings. The vision he set into motion of a city aligned with stars, of water flowing with order, of temples rising like prayers, did not end with him. It grew. His successors would build upon it. They would take his foundation and lift it higher. They would carve more, dig deeper, dream farther. But his spirit remained. Long after his name faded from memory, the design of his life continued in sandstone and soil. The grid of Angkor followed his logic. The reservoirs mirrored his lakes. The temple mountains echoed the one he placed on Phnom Bakheng. In time, Angkor would become a wonder, a capital of divine geometry and living stone. But without Yasovarman, there would have been no Yashodharapura, no starting line for the greatness to come. Even today, as the jungle reclaims what once was his, the stones whisper his story. The sun still rises over Phnom Bakheng, casting light over a city that began with one man's quiet, unwavering vision. In the end, Yasovarman did not chase glory. He built it, step by step, stone by stone, with a mind tuned to the stars and a heart rooted in the earth. Chapter 6. The Builders of Angkor. In the centuries after Yasovarman I, Angkor did not sleep. It grew slowly, steadily, purposefully, like a great tree spreading its roots and raising its crown toward the sky. Among the hands that shaped it, few left a mark as lasting as Rajendravarman. He came to power in the mid-10th century, a time of rebuilding, of realignment. Though the empire had not fallen, it had softened at the edges. Lines had blurred, territories wavered, and the capital needed strength. What Rajendravarman offered was not conquest, but clarity. His reign began with a return to purpose. He understood that an empire, like a temple, needed structure, a framework, a sacred order, and so he began to reimagine Angkor not as a scattered collection of temples and homes, but as a unified, breathing city. He revived Yashodharapura's central plan. Temples were aligned, canals were extended, roads were repaired. He initiated the construction of Prey Rup, a magnificent temple mountain built from laterite and brick, its towers glowing red in the evening sun. Not far from it, the East Mebon rose like a stone island in the center of the East Baray Reservoir, a place where water, land, and sky converged in sacred symmetry. Each structure was placed with intent. Each followed a hidden order, a grid of divine geometry that matched the movement of stars, the shape of mountains, the rhythm of the land. Rajendravarman did not build as a show of wealth. He built to bind the empire together, spiritually, politically, and physically. His temples were not just places of worship. They were anchors, markers, guideposts in a world being reshaped. He ruled not with noise but with vision, and under his quiet hand the city of Angkor began to take the form that would make it eternal. Suryavarman thus, the empire expands. When Suryavarman I came to the throne, he came not from a simple succession, but from the struggle of many hands reaching for power. He was an outsider, likely from the south, and his claim was not welcomed by all. Yet with strength, diplomacy, and resolve, he secured his rule. And once he did, he turned his gaze outward, across the rivers, through the forests, beyond the lands his ancestors had held. Suryavarman. I was not only a builder, he was a unifier. Through both sword and negotiation, he brought together regions that had long existed in tension. Kingdoms in the west bowed to his influence. Distant provinces acknowledged his crown. He stitched together territories not just by force, but through a promise of justice, of law, of stability. They called him the King of Justice. His rule brought with it new clarity. He reorganized administration, built watchtowers, and appointed local governors loyal to the throne. He reinforced the importance of central law. And while others had ruled by divine right, Suryavarman ruled also by logic. But he did not forget the divine. His temples spoke of both earthly power and celestial vision. The grand Phimianakas, nestled in the royal palace enclosure, began during his reign. It was a temple of mystery, a high pyramid crowned by a golden tower, its summit said to be visited by divine spirits. He also continued the development of the city's sacred grid, ensuring that each structure, whether spiritual or civic, aligned with the greater whole. Water still flowed, roads still reached outward, but now all of it moved with purpose. Suryavarman, I expanded the empire's borders, but more than that, he expanded its idea, its sense of itself. Under him, the Khmer realm was no longer a kingdom of river valleys. It became a vision, vast, connected, ambitious. And in that vision, the seeds of greatness were planted deep. Temples as political symbols. In Angkor, temples were not merely places of prayer. They were messages, written in stone, shaped by power meant to last forever. To the outside eye, they were shrines to gods, but to the Khmer elite, they were symbols of rule. Each tower that rose was a statement. Each doorway, carved with scenes of battle and creation, told a deeper story. Temples showed who ruled, where, and why. They marked territory as much as they marked devotion. When a king built a temple, he did not only honor Shiva or Vishnu, he declared, "This is mine, this is sacred, this land is watched by heaven and ruled by me." Temple mountains mirrored Mount Meru, the cosmic axis. To climb their steps was to move closer to the divine, but also closer to the king's authority. The very architecture said it clearly: order begins here, with the king at the center. Temples were also built across provinces far from the capital, as outposts of royal presence. They functioned as spiritual stations, but also as political ones. Priests who maintained them were often loyal to the king. Their rituals reinforced central rule. Their location reminded all who lived nearby that they were part of a greater realm. Inscriptions on temple walls spoke of the king's deeds, his victories, his gifts, his line of descent. These were not myths alone, they were records, histories carved to endure rain, heat, and time. Even the choice of deity mattered. A ruler who favored Vishnu over Shiva was not just making a theological choice, he was sending a signal of peace or war, of continuity or change. The Khmer temple, then, was both altar and archive, both sanctuary and seal. In Angkor, belief and rule were never far apart. They walked together, climbed the same stairs, and looked out over the same empire, an empire of faith and function. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Angkor was no longer a dream. It was a living, breathing world, where spirit and strategy moved hand in hand. The capital had grown vast. Roads stretched out like veins, reservoirs shimmered beneath the sky, markets bustled, monks chanted, diplomats arrived from India, China, and beyond. The city had become not just the heart of an empire, but a center of Asia itself. Its layout was both sacred and practical. Reservoirs supplied water year-round, canals carried rice and goods, bridges linked districts, temples offered spiritual order, while administrative centers kept the gears turning. Every structure, from shrines to granaries, served a purpose. This was not a city built only for worship. It was built for life, for continuity, for the movement of people, the harvest of fields, the march of armies, and yet it remained a place of beauty, of wonder, of balance. From the top of a temple tower, one could see the layout clearly. The city did not sprawl, it breathed, it followed lines, it echoed the heavens. This fusion of faith and function became the Khmer hallmark. The sacred was not set apart, it was woven into the everyday. A farmer tilled his field near a shrine. A king held court beside a sacred pond. Pilgrims and merchants shared the same roads. In Angkor, the divine was not a distant mystery. It was part of the stone, the soil, the rhythm of the year. This harmony would hold for generations. And though the city would continue to rise, to change, to be reshaped by future kings, its soul was already formed. Angkor was no longer just a place, it was a way of being, an empire not only of space, but of meaning, and it would soon enter its golden age. Chapter 7. The Warrior King, Jayavarman VII. In the stillness before dawn, the world often feels undecided, quiet, suspended between night and day. It was in such moments that empires rose, and among them rose a man who would shape the Khmer world in both stone and fire. His name was Jayavarman II. His path to power was not straightforward. It did not flow gently like the canals of Angkor. It was sharp, steep, and shadowed by conflict. The early 12th century was a time of turbulence. The throne of the Khmer Empire, though glorious, was contested. Rivals emerged, allegiances shifted like clouds. Into this uncertain landscape stepped a man of rare will. Jayavarman was not born into uncontested rule. He fought for it, not with rage, but with relentless clarity. Battle by battle, province by province, he secured his claim. He challenged an existing king, perhaps even a co-ruler. And when the dust settled, it was his standard that flew above the city, his name that echoed through the temple halls. But Jayavarman was more than a warrior. He was a planner, a visionary, a man whose eyes saw not only the battlefield, but the blueprint of eternity. Once secure on the throne, he did not retreat into luxury. He advanced across borders, through ideas into history. The empire's edges extended under his rule. Its roads were strengthened, its armies mobilized, and within Angkor something even greater stirred. Not a campaign of conquest, but of creation. For the king who fought for his crown would now build something that could never be taken, Angkor Wat, a temple for eternity rising from the earth. Like a dream in stone, Angkor Wat is not merely a building, it is a statement, a prayer, a world turned inward and upward. Commissioned by Jayavarman II and likely begun in the early years of his reign, this immense temple complex was unlike anything the Khmer had ever built, and nothing like it would ever be built again. Angkor Wat was dedicated to Vishnu, the god of protection and order. This alone marked a quiet shift, as most kings before had honored Shiva. But for Jayavarman it was fitting. He saw himself not only as ruler, but as preserver, the one who brought balance to the realm and perhaps to the cosmos itself. The layout of Angkor Wat mirrored the Hindu universe. At its heart stood Mount Meru, the sacred center of all things. Around it rose towers, 5 in total, symbolizing the peaks of this celestial mountain. The entire complex was surrounded by a vast moat, wide and still, representing the cosmic
ocean. One did not simply walk into the temple, one crossed into another world. Its galleries stretched far.
Along the sandstone walls, stories unfolded, epic scenes from the Ramayana and Mahabharata, tales of gods and demons, heavens and hells. One panel, more than 150 meters long, told the tale of the churning of the ocean of milk, a cosmic's struggle to obtain the nectar of immortality. But it was not just the stories that stunned. It was the silence between them, the scale, the symmetry, the serenity of the lotus towers against the morning sky. Angkor Wat was more than a temple. It was a calendar. Its corridors aligned with the sun. Its towers marked equinox and solstice. As the light shifted, so too did the shadows, tracing time like the breath of the divine. Tens of thousands of laborers, artisans, and architects worked to bring this vision to life. They carved stone as if it were silk. They lifted towers as if touching stars. Jayavarman would not live to see it fully completed. But he built it not for a moment. He built it for eternity. Warfare and the reach of Khmer arms. Jayavarman's empire was not contained within its temples. Beyond the quiet halls of Angkor Wat, the world was shifting, and the Khmer moved with it. The king was not content with symbolic rule. He led with steel as much as with stone. His campaigns reached into Vietnam, clashing with the kingdom of Viet. To the west he pushed into what is now Thailand, asserting dominance over the powerful Mon city-states. In the north he sought influence among the mountain tribes and trade routes that connected the region to China. Jayavarman was a king of movement. His armies marched across forests and rivers, across hills and narrow passes. They carried standards bearing the faces of gods. They brought not only weapons but architecture, building temples even in conquered lands, extending not just borders but belief. His warfare was strategic. He understood that to control trade was to control wealth. He fortified key points, secured highways, and nurtured relationships with distant courts. Some inscriptions speak of tribute from as far as Bengal and diplomatic exchanges with Song China. But with war came risk. In time, the expansionist energy stirred resistance. The borders of empire stretched thin. Armies were pulled in many directions. Victories were gained, but not all were held. Still under Jayavarman, the Khmer military machine reached its peak, not just in size but in sophistication. Cavalry, infantry, war elephants, naval units, all moved in coordinated rhythm. The king ruled not only from the throne but from the front. He was not merely a builder or a priest. He was a warrior, and he believed that to serve the gods was also to defend what they had given, the God King's final offering. In the end, all kings fall silent. Even those who build temples as large as cities, or who lead empires across mountains and seas. The final days of Jayavarman II are a mystery, softened by time, blurred by myth. He may have died in battle, perhaps in the lands of Jayavarman, or perhaps he passed in the quiet of his capital, beneath the same sun that once rose over Angkor Wat's first stones. We do not know where his body rests. Some believe he was buried within Angkor Wat itself, that the great temple was not only his gift to the gods, but his own final resting place. Yet no royal tomb has ever been found. The corridors remain empty of sarcophagi, the sanctuaries hold no remains, and perhaps that is fitting, for Jayavarman's legacy does not lie beneath the earth, it rises above it, in towers that catch the light of dawn, in carvings that stretch across time, in stones that hum with the memory of his vision. He did not leave behind children to continue his line, but he left a temple that continues to speak. His reign marked both a climax and a turning. Under his hand, Angkor reached its height in beauty and ambition. But his absence created a silence, a pause before the next chapter. Jayavarman II was many things, a general, a mystic, a mathematician of the sacred, but above all he was a builder of empire, of monument, of memory, and in the heart of the Cambodian jungle, surrounded by lotus ponds and quiet skies, that memory still stands, as steady as stone, as soft as prayer. Chapter 8. Temples of Heaven and Earth. In the soft light of morning, when the mist still clings to the palm trees and the air feels heavy with dreams, the silhouette of a Khmer temple rises against the horizon. Quiet, symmetrical, and immense. To those who built it, this was more than architecture. It was a reflection of the universe. Khmer temples were not random collections of towers and corridors. They followed a sacred order, one that mirrored the structure of the cosmos itself. At the heart of this vision was Mount Meru, the mythical mountain at the center of all existence. In Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, it is the axis mundi, the central pillar of the universe where the divine resides and from which all life flows. To build a temple in the Khmer Empire was to recreate this sacred geography in stone and earth. The central sanctuary represented Mount Meru. The surrounding towers symbolized the mountain's lesser peaks. Moats reflected the cosmic ocean. Outer walls defined the boundary of the known world. Everything had meaning. Everything was placed with care. The temple was aligned with the stars, the seasons, and the sun. Equinoxes cast shadows through its gates. Solstices struck exact corners of its walls. The journey through the temple, from outer courtyard to inner shrine, mirrored a spiritual path from the everyday to the eternal. It wasn't just belief, it was design. A belief so deeply woven into the stones that the entire empire, from its smallest shrines to its greatest monuments, followed the same silent rhythm. To walk into a Khmer temple was to step into a map of heaven, one built on earth, with hands, with hope, and with time, reliefs, dances, and divine tales. As you move through the temple halls, past the heavy stone pillars and into the shadowed corridors, stories begin to emerge, not spoken, but carved. These are the bas-reliefs, and they cover the walls like tapestries of eternity. Each relief tells a tale. Gods in chariots, demons in battle, lovers in embrace, kings in ceremony, every scene etched into sandstone with a patience that only sacred purpose can sustain. At Angkor Wat, a single gallery unfolds the tale of the churning of the ocean.
Of milk. Here, gods and demons pull on the body of a giant serpent, wrapped around a sacred mountain, turning it like a spindle.
From this churning come the gifts of the universe, the moon, the sun, the goddess of beauty, and the elixir of immortality. The figures are alive in their stillness. Muscles ripple, eyes focus, flames flicker. Each one was carved with detail, not only for beauty, but for teaching. These were the stories that anchored faith, that explained creation, that justified the power of kings. But among the most iconic images found throughout the temples are the apsaras, celestial dancers, divine women, spirits of grace and joy. They stand on the pillars, they dance on the walls. Hair tied in elaborate crowns, fingers curved in sacred gestures. Their faces carry a soft smile, the smile of a world that has no need to rush. These dancers are not still. They move through time, through memory. They are reminders that even in the most sacred places there is room for beauty, for rhythm, for life. And so the temples became not only places of worship, but galleries of sacred art, where stories were told without words, and faith moved not just in prayer, but in dance. Buddhism begins to bloom. For centuries, the Khmer world was shaped by the rhythms of Hindu belief. Its kings followed Shiva and Vishnu. Its temples echoed Indian epics. Its ceremonies praised gods older than time, but nothing stays still, not even in stone. By the 12th century, a quiet change had begun. A new breath of belief moved through the empire, gentle, soft, and serene. Buddhism, long present at the edges of Khmer life, began to move toward its center. At first, it was not a replacement, but an addition. Buddhist monks walked beside Hindu priests. Shrines to the Buddha stood beside images of Shiva. The old gods were not cast aside. Instead, the new faith settled into the spaces between. Unlike the gods of Hinduism, the Buddha was not divine by birth. He was a man, one who had walked, suffered, awakened. His story offered a different kind of salvation, not through ritual, but through insight, through stillness, through compassion. The people responded. Buddhism offered a quiet path. It asked for mindfulness, not sacrifice. It welcomed farmers, traders, women and kings alike. In an empire growing ever more complex, it offered peace. And so the temples changed. Slowly, images of the meditating Buddha appeared in niches once reserved for deities of war. New temples were built with lotus motifs with softer lines. Some kings embraced the new faith publicly. Others kept it close, personal, silent. By the time of Jayavarman VII, Buddhism would rise to the throne. But even before him, its roots had begun to grow. In the quiet corners of great temples, in the footsteps of pilgrims, in the carved smile of a Buddha statue half hidden by vine and dust. The old world did not vanish. It evolved, and in that evolution, the Khmer Empire revealed its greatest strength, its ability to hold many truths at once. Living stone, breathing faith. A Khmer temple is not just a monument. It is a place of breath, of prayer, of footsteps echoing on ancient stone. Though built to last, these temples were not meant to be silent. They lived. In their chambers, monks chanted before dawn. They swept the floors, lit incense, rang bells that sent sound across still water. Pilgrims came from far villages bringing flowers, food, folded cloth. They whispered prayers, they touched the stone. Every part of the temple had meaning. The outer gates welcomed the world, the inner sanctums held the divine. Between them lay walkways for reflection, courtyards for teaching, spaces where people and gods met in quiet. Festivals brought music, light, and movement. Torches flickered along carved walls. Dancers performed near sacred pools. Offerings floated down canals, carrying wishes into the dark. Even the architecture responded. Ventilation shafts guided the breeze. Windows cast sacred patterns of light. Pools reflected the sky, drawing heaven down to earth. These were not ruins. Not then. They were homes for belief, and belief needs more than ceremony. It needs space, time, stillness. These temples gave all three. Even now, centuries later, the stones hold a memory, not just of who ruled or what was built, but of how. People lived with the divine, not apart from it. Not in fear of it, but close. Daily. Simply. To walk through the temples today is to feel that presence. Faint, like the echo of a bell long since quieted, but still vibrating through the air. Because the stones were never meant to stand alone. They were meant to breathe. Chapter 9. The Return of the Sage, Jayavarman VII. Before peace, there was fire. Before a golden reign, there was collapse. The Khmer Empire, once radiant under the hands of Suryavarman II, began to fade in the years that followed his death. The stones of Angkor Wat still shimmered in the morning light, but the empire behind them had lost its balance. There were no strong successors. Power shifted hands too quickly. The divine silence of the temples was interrupted by the sound of
marching feet, not Khmer feet, but foreign ones.
The invaders came from Champa, a powerful kingdom from what is now central Vietnam. In the year 1177, they did not simply raid, they struck deep into the heart of the Khmer world. They came by river, swift and sudden, and captured the capital. The great city of Angkor, proud, immense, holy, was desecrated. Fires burned, statues fell. The empire's heart was pierced. In the years that followed, the Khmer world stood shaken. Provinces wavered, roads emptied. The berets, once full of life-giving water, turned quiet, still, uncertain. The people whispered of gods forgotten, of kings who did not return, of temples that could not protect them. But in this darkness, from the margins of the empire came a man whose name would not just restore Angkor, it would redefine it. His name was Jayavarman VII. He did not rise in haste. He watched. He waited. And when he moved, it was with quiet certainty, not to reclaim power, but to rebuild a soul. The Bodhisattva King Jayavarman VII was unlike any ruler who came before him. He did not see kingship as privilege, he saw it as service. To him the throne was not a seat of glory, it was a place of responsibility, of suffering shared. And in this he modelled himself not on the ancient gods of fire and war, but on the Bodhisattva, the enlightened being, who postpones nirvana to aid the suffering of others. Specifically, Jayavarman aligned himself with Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion. His inscriptions do not boast of conquest. They mourn the pain of his people. In one, he writes that he suffered more from the suffering of his subjects than from his own wounds. To rule, for him, was not to dominate. It was to heal. Jayavarman VII came to power in the late 12th century. His first act was not revenge, but restoration. He pushed back the Cham invaders, yes. He reclaimed the capital. But even more, he set out to restore balance, harmony, dignity. His vision was Buddhist, deeply and clearly so. Not the distant Buddhism of philosophy and retreat, but a living Buddhism, practical, tender, rooted in daily life. Under his rule, Angkor became a city of both temples and hospitals, of statues and rest stops, of prayers and provisions and public care. Jayavarman was not only a warrior or builder. He was a sage, a man who placed wisdom before power, compassion before pride, and the land, once broken, began to breathe again. Bayon, Faces of Enlightenment, in the heart of Angkor Thom, the new capital city founded by Jayavarman VII, stands, a temple unlike any other. It is not vast in scale like Angkor Wat. It does not stretch outward into perfect symmetry. Instead, it rises inward, upward, coiled in corridors, clustered in towers, mysterious, haunting, and full of life. This is Bayon. At first glance, it seems chaotic, like a dream carved from stone. But step closer, and the faces appear. Dozens of them. Tower after tower, each bearing 4 serene faces facing north, south, east, and west. They are not fierce. They do not shout. They do not demand. They smile, gently, eternally. Some say they are the faces of Avalokiteshvara. Others believe they are the face of Jayavarman himself, or both. A king and a bodhisattva joined in stone. Their eyes are half closed, seeing inward and outward at once. Their mouths are soft, content. Around them, the temple's galleries unfold. Bas-reliefs show scenes of everyday Khmer life, markets, fishing boats, battles, parades. Gods and villagers, kings and cooks, all share the same stone. Bayon is not a place of grandeur. It is a place of presence, of mindfulness. It is less a monument to conquest and more a reflection of an inner truth, that the path to enlightenment begins in how we see one another. The temple's labyrinthine design invites one to wander, to lose direction, to surrender control. It is not meant to impress, it is meant to quiet. Bayon is the spirit of Jayavarman in stone, not commanding from above, but watching, guiding, waiting with compassion. Even now, as vines creep and time erodes, the faces remain. Smiling. Hospitals, roads, and rest houses. Jayavarman VII's temples were sacred, but his care extended far beyond stone. Across the empire, he ordered the construction of more than 100 hospitals. Simple structures staffed with monks and healers, They offered medicine, water, and rest. In an age when suffering was often seen as fate, Jayavarman saw it as something to be eased. Along the empire's vast network of roads, he built rest houses called dharmasalas. These were places where travellers could stop, pray, eat, and sleep. They stood like gentle beacons every few miles across the empire's spine. Water tanks were dug nearby. Trees were planted for shade. The empire became not only navigable, but nurturing. The roads themselves were reinforced, widened. Bridges of stone replaced simple wood. Trade flowed. Pilgrims moved freely. Monks journeyed to and from distant monasteries. Jayavarman did not rule from a palace. He ruled through movement, through care, through access. His public works were not displays of luxury. They were lifelines. He also built educational institutions, likely attached to temples, where monks taught not only scripture, but logic, language, and ethics. The kingdom's children, born into a golden age of compassion, learned by example. Never before had the Khmer people been so seen, so valued, and all of it stemmed from one man's belief that kings should not merely be worshipped, but should serve. Jayavarman VII understood something timeless, that the strength of an empire is not measured only by the temples it builds, but by the hands it holds. Chapter 10. The City of a Million Souls. At dawn the city would stir, not with noise, but with rhythm. The light, soft and gold, would spill over the tops of palm trees. Shadows of towers stretched across still ponds. A breeze carried the scent of rice, incense, and the faint perfume of lotus petals. And with the sun's first breath, Angkor came alive. This was not a capital in the ordinary sense. This was a living world, vast and humming with life. At its peak, Angkor was the largest
city on earth.
A metropolis spread across more than 400 square kilometers, 20 times the size of medieval London. Yet it did not tower with castles or crowd with walls. It breathed in balance with nature, surrounded by fields and forests stitched together, by canals and bridges shaded by trees planted in rows. Each morning, markets unfolded like flowers. Straw mats were rolled out near temple walls. Wooden stalls lined the roads. Traders from across the empire and beyond arrived with goods, fragrant spices, river fish, woven cloth, salt from the coasts, ivory from the highlands, copper tools, dried herbs and baskets brimming with fruit. Voices mingled like birdsong, soft bartering, laughter, greetings, prayers. Beside the markets, monks moved barefoot through the dust. Their robes were dyed saffron, their bowls carried in silence. Householders greeted them with offerings, sticky rice, palm sugar, and fresh water. The exchange was wordless, sacred. To feed a monk was to earn merit, to touch the divine through kindness. Some monks paused beneath banyan trees to teach. Children gathered, knees folded, eyes wide. They listened to tales of the Buddha, of karma, of peace. In this city, religion was not hidden behind walls. It walked freely, clothed in orange and humility. There were shrines on every corner. There were rituals at every hour. And yet the city never felt hurried. It moved with grace, with patience. It did not compete with nature. It harmonized with it. The people of Angkor, though temples soared and kings were crowned, it was the people. The ordinary, unseen many who gave Angkor its soul. They lived in wooden houses raised on stilts, shaded by trees and cooled by the breeze. Their homes were simple, yet alive with colour. Children played with clay toys in the dirt. Grandmothers chewed betel nut and told stories by the fire. Fathers ploughed the fields with oxen, their backs darkened by the sun. These were the farmers, rice growers who understood the earth. They worked the paddies during the wet season, planting and harvesting with rhythm and care. The empire depended
on them. Their work, humble and daily, kept the city fed and the temples blessed with offerings. There were builders too, men with hands calloused from stone.
They carved sandstone blocks into lotus petals. They lifted beams, mixed mortar, and shaped the dreams of kings into temples that would outlive them all. Their labor was sacred. To build was to pray with one's body. Dancers practiced in temple courtyards, their fingers curling like the petals of orchids. Their movements were not mere art, they were rituals, embodied hymns. They wore golden crowns and silk sashes. They told stories through stillness and spin, through eyes and breath. The Apsara dance was not performance, it was devotion. Alongside them were servants and cooks, blacksmiths and potters, weavers and scribes. Each played their part. Each kept the city moving gracefully, silently, uncelebrated. Angkor was not only a city of kings and gods, it was a city of people, of sweat and breath, of kindness and craft, 1,000,000 souls, each one a thread in the vast tapestry. And like the rivers that flowed past their homes, they lived not in haste, but in rhythm, education, and sacred knowledge. In the cool halls of monasteries and the shaded edges of libraries, another world unfolded, quieter, slower, but no less vital. This was the world of knowledge. The Khmer elite valued not only power, but wisdom. Their education was spiritual, practical, and celestial. Children of noble families studied under monks beginning with language, Sanskrit, the sacred tongue, and Khmer, their native voice. They learned to read palm leaf manuscripts, their spines threaded and their surfaces etched with ink and patience. These manuscripts held more than prayers. They held the secrets of the stars. Astrology was a serious science. The movement of planets and stars dictated everything, from royal coronations to harvest days. Learned monks and court scholars studied lunar calendars, aligned rituals with constellations, and read omens in the night sky. Even temple architecture followed the heavens, aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and divine geometry. Mathematics followed. So did logic, law, governance, morality. But the heart of Khmer education was always spiritual. Students memorized sutras and chanted mantras before dawn. They copied teachings line by line, not just to remember, but to embody. Learning was not just knowledge, it was transformation. For the general people, education was more oral, folk. Tales were passed from mother to daughter, proverbs shared in rice fields, chants repeated during festivals. Wisdom lived in stories, in rhythm, in ritual. And so whether in palace halls or village temples, the flame of learning was kept alive. It burned gently, never boastful, but steady, lighting minds, shaping hearts, guiding the city through darkness. In Angkor, the mind was not separate from the spirit. To know was to be closer to the divine. Life among the temples. In no other city on earth did the sacred stand so close to daily life. The temples of Angkor were not distant monuments. They were neighbors, guardians, constant companions. They rose from the jungle like dreams, silent and golden in the morning light, vast and violet at dusk. and around them life continued. Children played at their steps, monks swept the courtyards, pilgrims arrived on foot, palms pressed together in prayer. The temples were more than places to worship. They were spaces to feel, to grieve, to celebrate, to wonder. Marriages were blessed in their courtyards. Babies were named at their gates. Festivals lit their towers with music, flame, and dance. Every month brought a new observance. The full moon brought prayers. The new moon brought reflection. Offerings were laid, bells were rung, and the scent of incense drifted skyward like 1,000 whispered hopes. People knew the stories carved into their walls, the heroes of the Ramayana and Mahabharata, the churning of the ocean, the dances of the gods. These tales were not distant myths. They were living lessons, retold by firelight, remembered by every heart. The architecture itself spoke. Doorways narrowed toward sanctums, guiding one from the outer world to the inner soul. The towers soared not to impress, but to point, to remind. Life was not only in the market or the home. It was also in stillness, in silence, in the breath between thoughts. At night, when the city hushed, the temples glowed under the stars. The stone cooled, the ponds reflected constellations, the faces of Bayon smiled softly in the moonlight, and in every house, from peasant hut to royal chamber, people slept beneath those towers, knowing they were watched, held, and remembered. Because to live in Angkor was to live with the sacred, not apart from it. It was to wake with prayer and sleep with poetry, to farm beneath carvings
of gods,
to love beneath the eye of eternity. And though the city would one day fall silent, for now it sang, in footsteps, in chants, in the rustle of palm leaves. The city of 1,000,000 souls breathed as one. Chapter 11. Shifting Faith. The Rise of Theravada Buddhism. For centuries, the Khmer Empire had moved in rhythm with the gods, a divine order upheld by sacred kings. The ruler was no ordinary man. He was Devaraya, the god-king, a living embodiment of Shiva or Vishnu, chosen not only to govern the land, but to balance the cosmos. Temples were built not just for worship, but to hold the axis of the universe. Every coronation was a sacred ritual, every reservoir, every road aligned with celestial purpose. And at the center of it all stood the king, seated between heaven and earth. But time, like the river, changes everything. Gently at first, then all at once. By the 13th century, the old beliefs began to lose their weight, not through rebellion or rejection, but through quiet fading. The world had shifted, the wars had come and gone, the people had endured loss and joy, conquest and recovery, and in that long turning, something new began to rise, something simpler, more personal. The great temples still stood, their towers piercing the sky, but fewer kings were claiming divine identity. The ceremonies were shorter. The sacred inscriptions spoke less of cosmic duty and more of human compassion. Where once the king ruled by divine right, he now ruled by moral example. The decline of the Devaraja cult was not a collapse. It was a soft departure, like mist leaving the jungle at dawn. In its place came another path, not a new one, but one that had long been present at the edges, waiting, quiet, patient. Theravada Buddhism. Theravada's arrival. It didn't arrive with force. It didn't come with armies or edicts. Theravada Buddhism flowed into the Khmer, whirled like a gentle stream, washing over the stones of tradition, softening the landscape of belief. It had long been present, whispered along trade routes, shared by monks from Sri Lanka and Burma, but now it began to take root. Theravada was different. It offered no pantheon of gods, no cosmic battles, no divine kings. It offered a man, Siddhartha Gautama, who had walked, suffered, awakened, and taught others to do the same. The Buddha was not a ruler, but a teacher. His path was not grand, but mindful. His truth was not about power, but about peace. Monks in plain robes arrived in villages. They taught not with thunder, but with silence. They recited the Dhamma. They shared stories of suffering, mindfulness, and liberation. People listened. People learned. New temples were built, smaller than the ones before, modest halls with sloping roofs, open-air shrines shaded by Bodhi trees. The Buddha was carved not in gold but in stone, seated in meditation, eyes closed, hands resting in peace. Theravada did not demand abandonment of the past. It did not erase memory. It simply invited reflection, and the Khmer people, weary of kings and wars, ready for stillness, embraced it. The transformation spread not through decree, but through daily life, one prayer, one chant, one quiet morning at a time, old gods in new robes. But faith, like people, does not shed its skin so easily. Though the old gods no longer ruled, they were not forgotten. Shiva still stood in temple corners. Vishnu still floated upon cosmic waters. Apsaras still danced on sandstone walls. Their stories lingered, etched deep into the soul of the land. What emerged was not a clean break, but a quiet blending. Temples once dedicated to Hindu deities now welcomed images of the Buddha. The great towers of Angkor Wat, once a shrine to Vishnu, slowly transformed into Buddhist sanctuaries. Statues of the Bodhisattva stood beside carvings of Rama and Krishna. Pilgrims offered lotus petals to both. The architecture remained. The carvings remained. But the energy shifted. The rituals became simpler, the hymns softer. The incense smoke rose not in fire, but in peace. It was as if the gods themselves had taken on new forms, not banished, but reimagined, not erased, but folded gently into new meanings. The Khmer people did not ask, which path is right? They walked both. They still believed in karma, still honored ancestors, still watched the moon and whispered wishes by candlelight, but now their focus turned inward, to intention, to compassion, to the moment. Even in stone you could feel a change. The new statues smiled differently. The faces were rounder, the eyes softer. The world of the gods had given way to a world of the heart. In this quiet coexistence, the Khmer spirit found balance again, a softer sacredness. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the empire's soul had shifted. Theravada Buddhism was no longer new. It had become the guiding light, not only in temples but in homes, in markets, in fields. It shaped how people lived, how they prayed, how they ruled. King. no longer claim to be gods. They claim to be servants of the Dharma. Royal inscriptions began to mention not cosmic mandates but acts of generosity. Rulers built monasteries, not just temples. They funded libraries of sacred texts. They supported wandering monks. They were judged not by conquest but by their care for the people. Art changed too. The grand, symmetrical lines of earlier Khmer design softened into more fluid forms. The Buddha appeared more frequently in sculpture than any god had before, always calm, always still. Ceremonies became quieter, festivals more reflective. Music lingered longer in the air. The sacred was no longer in the distant stars, but in the act of giving, of listening, of pausing. And in homes across the empire, small altars were built. Simple shelves holding a Buddha statue, a candle, a bowl of water, a few yellow flowers. Children bowed before them each morning. Elders whispered prayers in the evening. The Khmer Empire was still mighty, still vast, still organized by roads and canals, temples and courts, but the empire's heart had changed. No longer did it beat to the drum of kings and gods. Now it beat like a breath, slow, quiet, kind. And though storms would come and changes would follow, this shift in faith, from divine command to inner calm, would remain. Because once a people find peace in the present, they carry it forward, even through the darkest of times. Chapter 12. Cracks in the Empire. For centuries, the Khmer Empire flourished in harmony with water. It was their lifeline, their teacher, their silent guardian. Canals carved through the land like veins, carrying nourishment to every corner. Reservoir, vast and glittering, held the monsoon rains like sacred offerings. The mighty berets stretched across the plains, reflecting both sky and ambition. But even the most precise machines wear down. Even the rivers can turn against their makers. By the early 14th century, something began to shift. The skies darkened differently. The rains no longer came on time. Sometimes they came in floods, sweeping away fields and homes. Other times they withheld their blessings for months, leaving the rice paddies cracked and dry. The people waited, prayed, planted late, and harvested less. Droughts returned, more frequent and unforgiving. The very systems that had once offered abundance, those majestic barrays and ancient canals, now strained under the pressure. Some silted up, others overflowed. The old engineers were gone. Their wisdom, etched in forgotten scripts, could not hold back the changing sky. Fields withered in the sun, the harvests grew thin, and with every poor season, the weight of the capital grew heavier. The city of Angkor, built for glory, needed to be fed. Temples needed offerings. Monks needed alms. Nobles needed tribute. But the land was tired. The empire had always drawn strength from the harmony between nature and spirit. Now that balance wavered. The rain no longer followed the chants. The river no longer listened to the priests, and in the quiet spaces between seasons, doubt began to bloom. Not loudly, not yet, but like water receding from a shore, it began to leave cracks behind. Enemies at the gates. As the fields suffered in silence, threats from beyond the borders began to grow louder. To the west, the Thai kingdoms were rising. Once under Khmer influence, they now carved their own paths, strong, ambitious, and restless. Sukhothai had already broken away. Ayutthaya, soon to follow, was preparing to challenge more than just boundaries. To the east, the ancient rivals of Champa stirred once again. Though diminished, they remembered the old wars. The memory of Khmer conquests still burned. And now, with Angkor distracted, they saw a chance to strike back. These enemies did not just want land. They wanted dignity, revenge, recognition. In the borderlands, fortresses were tested. In the forests, scouts vanished. Raids came at night. Temples once lit by oil lamps were now guarded by swords. The Khmer armies still stood strong, but they were thinner, stretched across too many fronts. The empire's borders were long, too long, and its center was fragile. In earlier times, the king had led the army himself, riding into the field with elephants and banners. But now the throne changed hands too often. Confidence wavered. Commanders hesitated. The monks prayed. The people whispered. The invaders weren't just breaking gates. They were breaking certainty. Angkor had once ruled from a place of supreme
power, its voice unquestioned, its wealth unshaken. But now that voice cracked.
That power flinched. Enemies no longer feared the empire, they tested its walls, and the walls, for the first time in centuries, began to answer weakly. Struggles of succession. A strong kingdom can survive a drought. It can survive war, but instability from within, that is the true erosion. After the death of Jayavarman VII, the empire struggled to find a leader with both vision and longevity. Successors came and went like passing seasons. Some ruled for only a handful of years. Others were puppets of powerful court factions. Few had the wisdom or strength to unify the court, the military, and the temples, and each change brought uncertainty. Royal advisors vied for control. Generals pledged loyalty, then shifted alliances. The nobles in the provinces grew more independent. Local governors began to act like kings in their own territories. What had once been a tightly woven tapestry of centralized rule began to fray at the edges. Even within the capital, whispers swirled of poisoned cups, of hurried coronations, of decisions made behind closed temple doors. The once glorious royal court of Angkor, home to serene dancers and wise sages, now echoed with footsteps of suspicion. The divine aura that had once wrapped itself around the throne began to fade. The king was no longer seen as the cosmic axis, the god on earth. He was a ruler, mortal, flawed, and replaceable. This unraveling at the top spread downward. Officials argued, taxation became erratic, records were lost, decisions were delayed. And as the government weakened, so too did the trust of the people. An empire can rise on faith, but it falls through confusion. The fields may fail, and the walls may tremble. But when the crown itself flickers, the very heart of a civilization begins to falter. And now that heart was beating unevenly. The echoes of excess Angkor had been built to dazzle the gods. Its towers reached for the heavens. Its canals carved order into the chaos of nature. Its art danced on stone, telling stories of divinity and destiny. For centuries it was the wonder of the world, a city of light and balance, power and peace. But what happens when the dream grows too large? The temples stood tall, but many now stood empty. The corridors, once filled with chanting monks and Royal processions echoed with silence. Roofs collapsed, pools dried, columns leaned. The jungle waited nearby, silent, watching, creeping closer. These temples required constant care, offerings, rituals, maintenance. But there were fewer priests now, fewer donations, fewer pilgrims. The palaces remained, but some were abandoned. Without heirs, without court, without purpose. Even the berets, those great reservoirs that once mirrored the skies, had begun to silt and stagnate. In the end, grandeur became a burden, a weight the people could no longer carry. The Khmer had
built for eternity, but eternity needs more than stone.
It needs people, belief, breath, and slowly the spirit of Angkor began to thin. Not vanish, but soften, like incense after prayer. Some villagers left the capital, moving to smaller towns. Others followed new kings, new beliefs. Trade shifted south. Politics followed, and the city that once held 1 million souls began to exhale, not all at once, but gently. The stone stayed. The stories stayed, but the heartbeat slowed. And though Angkor still stood, the light within it had begun to dim, not in tragedy, but in quiet surrender. A season had ended, and the wind now carried the sound of something else. Not collapse, but change. Chapter 13. The Twilight of Kings. In the golden haze of the 14th century, a shift begins, not sudden, not violent, but steady. West of the Khmer heartland, beyond the familiar rhythms of the Mekong and the aging temples of Angkor, a new city rises from the lowland plains. Ayutthaya. Founded along the Chao Phraya River, it was a place of trade, of ambition, of sharpened swords and expanding faith. While Angkor clung to the past, to the memory of divine kings of stone carved with the names of gods and conquests, Ayutthaya
looked to the future. Its rulers were not born of Deva lineage or Vishnu's cosmic blessing.
They were practical, worldly, and unshackled from the myths that once bound empires, and they moved swiftly. By the mid-1300s, Ayutthaya was no longer just a city. It was a kingdom, a hungry one. Its armies moved eastward, sensing the weakness of its aging neighbor. Khmer generals, once the stuff of legend, now led fragmented forces with outdated tactics. The infrastructure of Angkor, strained by centuries of population war and climate, could not support a full defense. And so, the balance tipped. Villages once paying tribute to the Khmer throne now sent offerings west. Regional lords, sensing the changing wind, switched loyalties. The Khmer king, still surrounded by his court of dancers, priests and advisers, seemed slow to act, or perhaps unable to. Ayutthaya's rise was not just military. It was cultural. The elegance of its courts, the vibrancy of its temples, and the promise of trade drew attention. Where Angkor had once been the center of Southeast Asia, now its orbit dimmed. A new sun had risen, and it cast a long shadow. Lost capitals, lost glory. Once there had been a center, a single shining capital that anchored the Khmer world. But now, as the years slipped by like water through stone, that center began to crumble. The mighty city of Angkor Thom, once home to hundreds of thousands, grew quiet. The reservoirs that once glittered like oceans in stone now dried and cracked. The canals choked with silt. The forests, once kept at bay by monks and laborers, crept forward, reclaiming their territory inch by inch. The royal court moved south, first to Longvek, then to Udong, later to Phnom Penh. Each shift a little smaller, a little closer to the river's edge, a little more distant from the power of the past. These were not cities of grandeur. They were places of refuge, of compromise, of survival. Gone were the days of parades along the causeways, of processions through gates guarded by gods. The kings no longer dreamed in sandstone. They lived in wooden halls, surrounded by bamboo, fences. The jungle swallowed what they left behind. The people, too, changed. Fewer artisans remained to carve apsaras in walls. Fewer scribes recorded the names of kings. Fewer monks kept the temples alive with chanting and incense. The great machine of the Khmer court, fed by conquest, irrigation, and divine rule, had broken, and with it the idea of permanence. All that remained was memory, memory etched into fading walls, memory told in hushed stories beside firelight, memory buried beneath moss, temples without worshippers. At the heart of the empire's decline stood its temples, silent, still, waiting. They had once been alive, not only with prayers, but with colour, music, incense, and belief. People had travelled days to reach them, bringing offerings of lotus and rice, gold and cloth. Monks had chanted into the rising sun. Kings had walked barefoot through sacred halls. But now the footsteps were gone. At Taprom, trees broke through the roof like fingers searching for light. Their roots wrapped the walls in a slow, crushing embrace. At Preah Khan, once a university and spiritual hub, only the wind passed through the galleries. At Bante Chma, intricate reliefs of gods and battles faded beneath centuries of lichen. Nature had returned with patience and precision. Rainwater wore away at inscriptions. Birds nested in crevices where once torches burned. Columns cracked, statues tumbled, and galleries filled with leaves. Yet despite the silence, there was beauty. To the traveller who found their way here, the ruins spoke in another voice, not of power, but of mystery. The faces of Bayon still smiled with enigmatic calm. The towers of Angkor Wat still caught the morning light with a golden glow, even if no priest stood to greet the dawn. These temples were no longer the seats of kings or the homes of gods. They had become memories carved in stone, a civilization's soul lingering long after its voice had faded. The last divine voices. The final Khmer kings ruled over fragments. Their courts were smaller, their titles more ceremonial, their influence often little more than tradition. Yet they still wore the crowns. They still recited the ancient rites. And they still believed, or hoped, that revival was possible. Some kings tried to reform what remained. They sought new alliances, they reopened roads, they rebuilt temples not with the ambition of Angkor, but with humble devotion. There were whispers of renaissance, brief flickers of resurgence, but none took hold. The world had changed. Theravada. Buddhism, introduced through contact with Sri Lanka and Ayutthaya, had replaced the old Devaraja cult. No longer was the king a god on earth. He was a patron, a protector, a man. The divine voice was quiet now, replaced by the calm teachings of impermanence, of suffering, of the middle path. Even the royal line grew uncertain. Inscriptions stopped, genealogies faded, titles blurred, one reign ended, another began. But the names did not echo like Jayavarman or Suryavarman. These were not kings of empires. They were caretakers of memory. And so the curtain fell. Not with war, not with fire, but with silence. A soft, endless silence, like the hush of jungle after rain, like the quiet breath of a world that had once danced with gods and now slept beneath trees, and yet it never truly ended. The Khmer Empire dissolved into soil and myth, but its heart still beats in stone, in the smile of a forgotten statue, in the steps of a traveller walking through.
Roots and ruins in the stories that whisper, even now, of a time when kings spoke with gods and cities bloomed like lotuses across the land.
Chapter 14. The jungle reclaims the stone. There was no final war, no collapse marked by thunder or fire. The Khmer Empire, once the heart of Southeast Asia, did not fall with a scream. It faded with a whisper. At its peak, Angkor had been a city of light and devotion, of water and stone, alive with ceremony and rhythm, but the end did not come with an invading army or a burning capital. It came gently, almost kindly, like a candle burning through its final hours, its flame flickering in the wind, too tired to resist. The signs had begun slowly. Canals no longer flowed as they once did. Harvests weakened. Monks left temples, empty. The great reservoirs cracked under the changing skies. Year by year, family by family, the city thinned. Some sought better soil, others safer lands. Some left for new centres of power, where new kings ruled and new faiths bloomed. Yet no one closed the gates. No one marked the date. The city simply emptied, one morning at a time. Angkor did not fall. It slept. As the people left, so did the rituals. The divine kings no longer walked the carved galleries. The voices that once called to the gods each dawn faded into silence. Temples, once surrounded by gardens and villages, were left to the wind and the rain. Statues stood alone, their purpose drifting like smoke in the warm air. The silence that followed was not lifeless. It was soft, deep, and ancient. The kind of silence that feels like breath before dreaming. In that hush, the city waited. It did not cry out. It did not resist. It allowed itself to be forgotten, to be folded back into the land from which it had risen, and so began the long vanishing. Nature, as keeper of memory time, is not always a destroyer. Sometimes it is a weaver, quiet, patient, purposeful. In Angkor, time did not break the city. Nature, too, did not rage against its stones. Instead, she wrapped it in an embrace, firm but tender. At Taprom, the silk cotton trees grew like guardians. Their roots flowed over walls like water, winding through passageways and wrapping pillars in thick, slow coils. They did not shatter the temple. They held it, as if keeping it from falling apart entirely. In the corridors of Preah Khan, vines stretched across ancient carvings, touching the worn feet of apsaras with green fingertips. Ferns sprouted in the quiet corners. Moss painted the floors with velvet softness. The jungle did not erase Angkor. It preserved it in secret. Even the light changed. Where once sun had blazed over stone, now it filtered through high canopies.
In beams, soft and golden, like memories. Birdsong replaced the chants of monks. The hum of insects filled the silence where once drums echoed. Nature did not ask why the people had gone.
It did not seek to understand the end of kings or the fall of dynasties. It only did what it has always done. It grew. Quietly, steadily, without sorrow or celebration. And in doing so, it became the keeper of Angkor's memory. Every root that curled through a doorway whispered, "Something sacred once lived here." Every leaf that drifted into a sanctuary said, "There was beauty here. There was life." No walls were left untouched. No tower stood without green company. Yet beneath it all the carvings remained. The faces still smiled. The gods still watched. The jungle had not destroyed the city. It had adopted it, and in that adoption, Angkor remained. Myths of the lost empire. Long after the royal courts had moved south, long after the last stone had been laid by human hands, Angkor became something else, not a city, but a story. Among the villages near the forests, whispers filled the air like mist. The old ones spoke of a kingdom built by gods. They said the temples had risen in a single night, summoned by a sorcerer, or shaped by giants who carried the stones from the mountains on their backs. Some said the trees grew not from seed, but from spells cast by forgotten priests. Children listened wide-eyed to tales of golden elephants buried beneath the roots, of cursed kings who wandered the ruins under moonlight, still trying to reclaim a throne that no longer existed. To the locals, Angkor was both real and not real, a place seen with the eyes and also with the heart. It was the realm of ancestors, of spirits and mysteries. Farmers, cutting wood near the temples, left offerings on moss-covered stones. Hunters, passing beneath the towers, whispered apologies. The city was not feared, but it was respected, as if it were still watching, still waiting. Even foreign travellers, those few who wandered near the ruins centuries later, reported strange feelings. Some wrote of the silence that seemed too deep. Others of the vines that seemed to move when no wind blew. There was awe, always, but also a sense that the place was alive in ways words could not describe. Angkor had faded from maps. It had slipped from royal memory. But in stories it grew larger. It became the city that could not die. A city forgotten by the world centuries past. Kingdoms rose and fell. Ships crossed oceans. Cities were born from steel and smoke. Yet in the thick forests of Cambodia, the stones of Angkor stood, untouched by time, unmarked by the world. There were no headlines. No scholars debated its meaning. No kings laid claim to its name. Angkor was not remembered. It was simply hidden. The jungle, in its quiet wisdom, held it close. Rain washed its faces clean. Shade kept its walls from the burn of sun. Roots lifted stones just enough to remind them they were not alone. Generations came and went with no knowledge of what lay beneath the leaves. The temples became nests for birds, homes for spirits, shrines for unseen gods. But Angkor waited. It waited through the rise of Ayutthaya and the fall of empires. through the arrival of traders and the writing of books. It waited while explorers mapped continents and empires drew new borders. It waited while the world forgot it had ever existed. And then, one day, centuries after the last royal footsteps had echoed through its halls, someone returned. In 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot found his way to the temples. His writings, filled with awe and disbelief, reintroduced Angkor to the modern world. He did not understand what he had found. Few did. But his words travelled, and with them so did wonder. Scholars came. Artists sketched. Photographers captured the carvings. Suddenly Angkor was not a ghost. It was a revelation. But even then it did not fully awaken. It remained calm, patient, unbothered by the attention. It had already survived forgetting. It knew how to wait, and so it waits still. Today, the paths are clear. Tourists walk where kings once walked. Light shows shine where torches once flickered. But the soul of Angkor remains unchanged. It is still a city of silence, still a city of stone and memory. And beneath the trees where vines kiss old gods and our roots wrap the stories of a forgotten people, Angkor dreams. Not of the past, not of glory, but of peace. It is not dead. It is simply resting, wrapped in green arms, cradled by time, alive in the way only lost things can be. Chapter 15. Rediscovery, the Western Gaze. The jungle had held its secret for centuries. Beneath layers of green and silence, Angkor slept, undisturbed, forgotten, wrapped in the arms of nature. But one day the silence broke. In the mid-19th century, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot set foot in the dense forests of Cambodia. He was not searching for an empire. He was looking for insects, plants, and the raw details of the natural world. But what he found instead would ripple across continents. Mouhot emerged from the forest to find stone towers rising above the trees. Faces smiled from walls wrapped in roots. Halls stood empty, sacred, and vast. Before him lay Angkor Wat, a marvel of scale and beauty that seemed almost impossible. How could such a place exist in this quiet corner of the world, unknown to the rest of it? He called it the Cambodian Pyramids. He compared it to the temples of Greece and Rome, to the wonders of Egypt and the lost cities of the Americas. But, unlike those, Angkor had no place in European stories. To the Western world, it was new, a mystery waiting to be solved. Mouhot's journals told a tale not just of stone and scale, but of astonishment. His words carried the wonder of a man who believed he had stumbled into legend. One of these temples, a rival to that of Solomon, and erected by some ancient Michelangelo, might take an honourable place beside our most beautiful buildings, he wrote. He imagined a vanished race, forgotten kings, and a lost civilization, so advanced it could not possibly belong to the ancestors of the people who now lived nearby. It was, in his eyes, too grand to be local, too refined to be native, and with that the myth began. Angkor was not just rediscovered, it was reborn, as a riddle, as a treasure, as a beautiful ghost summoned from the jungle. The empire through foreign eyes. After Mouhot's writings spread through Europe, curiosity blossomed into obsession. Scholars, missionaries, artists, and adventurers came from across the world to see what he had seen. They brought with them tools and notebooks, sketch pads and cameras, and they left with ideas. The first images of Angkor to reach Western eyes were sketches. Artists drew the towers of Angkor Wat in perfect perspective, shaded the smiling faces of Bayong, and traced the tangled roots of Ta Prohm. These drawings found their way into newspapers, books, and museums. Each sketch added a layer to the legend. To many, Angkor seemed out of place in Southeast Asia. European minds, shaped by the age of empire and superiority, struggled to accept that the same people who now lived in bamboo homes and farmed rice fields had once carved gods into stone and built cities larger than anything in Europe during the same era. So they imagined something else. Some claimed the ruins must have been built by Indians. Others said they were evidence of a long-lost race. The Khmer people themselves were often left out of the story altogether, as if the stones had simply appeared from nowhere. The writings that followed Muhot described a city swallowed by time, a world lost in green shadow, but they also misunderstood. The temples were described as Buddhist when they were Hindu, or Hindu when they were Buddhist. The Khmer Empire was framed as a tragic mystery rather than a rich, evolving civilization. Western eyes saw Angkor as a puzzle, but not always one they tried to understand. Sometimes it was enough to marvel. And so through their gaze the Khmer Empire was reimagined, a reflection not of the past, but of the West's fascination with ruins, mystery, and beauty beyond its borders. Colonial ambitions and sacred stones. As the 19th century turned to the 20th, France's interest in Angkor deepened, not just as a wonder, but as a symbol. Cambodia became part of French Indochina, and with that, Angkor was no longer just a discovery. It was colonial property. Seeds, French began mapping the temples. Archaeologists arrived, hired by the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, to study and conserve the ruins. Restoration projects were launched, and crumbling towers were carefully taken apart and rebuilt, piece by piece. Giant trees were removed from roofs. Stones were numbered, catalogued, and reassembled with the precision of a puzzle. On one hand, this was a gift. Without these efforts, much of Angkor might have collapsed beneath centuries of rain and root. The temples were studied, preserved, and slowly brought back into the light. But on the other hand, the gaze of empire remained. The Khmer past was presented through French words. Exhibitions of Angkorian art were shown in Paris. The temples became images in colonial postcards, symbols of France's civilizing mission, as if the ancient Khmer had created greatness, only to be rediscovered and cared for by Western hands. Sacred sites became backdrops for officials and tourists. Stones that had once echoed with prayers now heard footsteps and shutters. The temples remained places of power, but now the power came from attention, from display, from foreign admiration. The local people watched all of this with quiet eyes. Many still left offerings at the altars. Monks returned to chant in the ruined halls. To them, Angkor was not a ruin. It was still alive. Yet their voices were quieter in the global conversation. The stones had been touched by other hands. The narrative, for a time, belonged to others. A wonder reawakens. In time, Angkor began to reclaim its own story. By the mid-20th century, Cambodia had begun to change. Colonial rule ended. The country sought its own path, its own voice. And in that process, Angkor became more than a marvel. It became a symbol of pride. The temples were no longer just curiosities, they were national treasures. School children learned the names of kings like Suryavarman and Jayavarman. The image of Angkor Wat was placed at the center of the Cambodian flag, a quiet but powerful declaration that this wonder belonged to the Khmer people, not to the myths of outsiders. Tourists still came. Researchers still studied, but the story shifted. Cambodian scholars led the excavations. Cambodian voices explained the carvings. Monks once again walked the causeways at sunrise, robes bright against the soft light. Angkor, once a city of silence, now murmured with new life, and yet the wonder remained. Visitors who arrive today still feel the same awe Muhot described, though now that awe is guided by deeper understanding. They learn of the water systems, the urban planning, the dynasties, the battles, the art. Angkor is no longer a blank canvas for imagination. It is a place of history, of culture, of human brilliance. But more than that, it is a place of feeling, even now standing beneath. The giant towers of Angkor Wat, the world grows quiet. Time seems to slow, the stone seems to breathe, and something ancient stirs in the air. Not mystery, not confusion, but memory. For centuries, Angkor waited beneath the trees. Now it is awake once more, not as a lost city, but as a living soul of a people who remember. It is not just rediscovered, it is remembered. And through that memory, it will never be lost again. Chapter 16. Preservation and Revival. In the quiet dawn of the 20th century, Angkor stood as it had for centuries, wrapped in jungle, watched by stone faces, held in the hands of time. For decades, French archaeologists and Cambodian caretakers had labored among the temples, clearing roots, lifting fallen stones, and mapping the sacred ground. But the peace was not to last. As the world outside grew restless, so did the land around Angkor. Cambodia, newly independent from colonial rule, in the 1950s faced internal struggles and regional storms. And through the 1970s, the darkness deepened. War swept across the country. Civil conflict grew into chaos. The Khmer Rouge, with their red flags and ruthless ideology, tore through the nation with a vision that sought to erase the past. And Angkor, that ancient symbol of royalty, religion, and refinement, stood directly in their path. Though the temples were spared outright destruction, the danger was ever present. The ruins, remote and difficult to protect, became vulnerable. To looters, artifacts vanished, stolen under cover of night, smuggled through borders, sold in markets far from the land they came from. Sacred statues were decapitated, delicate carvings chiseled from their walls. Angkor Wat, the central temple, remained largely intact. But beyond it, in places like Banteay Chma and Preah Khan, the damage was profound. Whole galleries of sculpture disappeared. Pieces of Khmer identity were scattered across the world, silent and displaced. The jungle, once a protector, could no longer keep the world away. And yet, even in the face of war and greed, the stones endured. Quietly, they waited. Beneath the broken lintels and fallen apsaras, the spirit of Angkor did not fade. It survived as it always had, not through force, but through patience. The archaeologists and guardians. When the fighting stopped, the silence that returned to Angkor was different. It was not the quiet of abandonment, but the pause before healing. In the 1990s, as Cambodia began to rebuild, so too did the effort to save Angkor. The global community turned its gaze once more toward the jungle, not as conquerors or romantics, but as protectors. UNESCO declared Angkor a World Heritage Site in 1992, marking a turning point in its modern story. Work began slowly. The damage was deep, not just from war, but from time, weather, and neglect. But there was hope. Teams from across the world arrived with tools, maps, and experience. French, Japanese, Indian, German, and Cambodian archaeologists joined hands, determined to restore what had nearly been lost. Stone by stone, the temples were studied. Each wall was photographed, catalogued, and stabilized. Conservation became a careful dance, one that balanced preservation with authenticity. The goal was never to rebuild Angkor anew, but to keep it standing, breathing, visible to generations yet to come. And crucially, Cambodians led the way. Young students trained as conservators, monks returned to pray. Local communities, once kept at a distance, were invited to take part in the care of the sacred grounds. Angkor was not just a historic site, it was a living memory, a national trust. In Siem Reap, the small city near the temples, new museums were built. Schools taught the language of the empire, Sanskrit and Old Khmer, so that the ancient inscriptions could speak once more. Craftspeople learned the old techniques of carving and sculpture and began to replace missing pieces, not with replicas but with reverence. This was not just repair. It was revival, a global act of memory, careful, quiet, and filled with respect. Angkor had survived many dangers, but now it had guardians, both local and global, who understood that the stones did not just hold history. They held the soul of a people, Angkor in the national soul. In the heart of Cambodia's flag, between bars of blue and red, stands a white outline, 3 towers rising like prayers into the sky. It is Angkor Wat, not as a ruin but as a symbol, a reminder, a promise. To the Khmer people, Angkor is not just an ancient city, it is an inheritance, a thread that connects today to yesterday, a quiet voice that reminds them who they are and who they have always been. Through the decades of conflict and rebuilding, the image of Angkor has remained steady. It appears on money, on stamps, in the names of schools, shops, and songs. It is drawn by children and carried by soldiers. It is honored by monks and studied by scholars. But more than this, it lives in the hearts of everyday people. To a farmer near Siem Reap, Angkor is the place his ancestors prayed. To a dancer in Phnom Penh, it is the origin of the classical gestures. Hands curved like apsaras, steps echoing the carvings on ancient walls. To a student reading the Ramayana, it is the land where those stories once shaped kings and calendars. Angkor is more than heritage. It is identity. In a country that has faced occupation, genocide, and poverty, the stones of Angkor stand as proof that greatness is not new. It is remembered. It is survived. It is built again. Each year, as the sun rises over Angkor Wat on Khmer New Year, people gather in silence. The air is filled with incense and soft voices. Flowers are laid before the altars. Drums echo in the distance. It is not a tourist event. It is not performance. It is remembrance. It is home. temples for tomorrow. Today, Angkor lives, or just in history books or ancient stories, but in the footsteps of millions. Tourists come from every corner of the world, drawn by the promise of mystery and the beauty of stone kissed by sunrise. They walk the causeways, they whisper beneath the towers, they marvel at the carvings, unaware of how close this place once came to vanishing. But alongside the wonder, there is responsibility. Too many visitors can wear down the paths. Flash photography fades the color. The quiet that once filled the temples can be lost beneath footsteps and chatter. And so caretakers walk a careful line. Modern Angkor is a site of balance between access and protection, between openness and reverence. Conservationists work daily to monitor the stones. Local guides teach visitors not just facts but respect. New paths are built to guide the flow. Certain areas are closed not to keep people out, but to let the place breathe. Beyond tourism, Angkor also lives through ritual. Monks still bless the temples. Pilgrims still kneel before Buddha statues. At Taprom, incense burns. At Bayon, voices chant. At Angkor Wat, lights shine on full moon nights, illuminating the path of ancient ceremonies. The temples have grown quiet before. They have waited in darkness, but now they glow again, not with power, but with presence. And in the schools of Siem Reap, children learn the stories. They memorize the names of the kings. They visit the temples and run their hands across the stone, not to study the past, but to feel it. For these temples are not frozen, they are seeds planted in history, growing still. They belong not just to Cambodia, but to the world. Yet above all, they belong to the future, to the children, who will light incense, to the monks who will chant again, to the voices that will carry the story forward, not as legend, but as life. Chapter 17. Echoes in the Stone. The Legacy of the Khmer Empire. In the deep silence of the Cambodian jungle, when the air is still and the cicadas are quiet, the ruins of Angkor seem to speak. Not with sound, but with presence. Even now, the temples stretch wide and high, carved with thousands of figures, walls etched with stories, towers shaped like lotus buds reaching skyward. These are not the ruins of a forgotten place. They are the bones of a great dream, a civilization that once stood at the center of Southeast Asia, bold and alive. At the heart of the Khmer Empire was belief in gods, in rulers, in order, in the power of stone and spirit to shape reality. They were builders not only of temples but of worlds. They shaped their land with care. Water was not an obstacle. It was a partner. Great berets or reservoirs captured rain and stored it through the seasons. Canals curved through the fields, feeding rice paddies and carrying life from one village to another. Their cities were not random. They were designed with intention, with sacred geometry, with cosmic alignment. And yet it was not only practical, it was poetic. To walk through Angkor is to walk through vision. Towers aligned with equinox suns. Temples arranged to mirror the heavens, carvings of gods, demons, dancers, warriors, all living side by side on the same stone stage. This was a people who saw no wall between the physical and the spiritual. They built as if building for both. Each stone was laid with purpose. Each story carved into the wall was part of something larger, not just a monument to a king, but a map of meaning, The city of Angkor was not just a capital, it was a model of the universe, a kingdom in harmony with sky and soil, body and soul. This was not only a civilization of builders, it was a civilization of believers. And through their belief, they left behind something that does not crumble with time. Faith, power, and beauty in balance. The Khmer Empire thrived on a delicate thread, stretched between faith and rule, between temple and throne. In most places, power and religion are uneasy allies, but in Angkor, for a time, they were one. The kings of the Khmer Empire did not rule as ordinary men. They were seen as Devaraja, god-kings, not just rulers, but living bridges between heaven and earth. When they built temples, they were not only building for worship, they were building for their own transformation, from man to divine, from dust to eternity. This belief gave the empire structure. Temples stood at the center of cities, guiding daily life. Monks served as teachers, record-keepers, spiritual anchors. Rituals shaped the calendar. The king's presence blessed the land just as the land fed the king. But with this harmony came a deep beauty. Art was not separate from worship. It was worship. Every carving told a sacred tale. Every step through a temple echoed the path of myth. In stone we see the turning of the world, battles between gods and demons, the dance of creation, the stillness of meditation. And yet this beauty was never only about the divine, it was also political. Temples proved the king's power. They declared his reach, his wealth, his right to rule. They bound the people to something larger, not just a kingdom, but a vision of cosmic order. But the balance was fragile. When the kings ruled well, with wisdom and humility, faith and power stood strong. But when ambition grew too fast, when temples rose too high and taxes grew too heavy, the balance began to break. Resources strained, the people suffered, the vision, once whole, began to fracture. Still the beauty remained, even as the empire waned, even as the kings grew weaker and the jungle crept closer, the art held its breath. It did not fade, it simply waited. Today it waits still. A reminder of what can happen when belief and leadership walk side by side. And what happens when that unity cracks Angkor as a mirror to the modern world. We look at Angkor now through the lens of history, but it looks back at us too, not as ruins, but as reflection. In the stories of its rise, we see the power of human vision, what it means to build not for the next season, but for the next century, what it means to believe in something greater than ourselves, and to shape the world around that belief. The Khmer Empire did not rise through conquest alone. It rose through connection between people, rivers, faiths, and ideas. Its cities were filled with artists and engineers, monks and farmers, all bound together by a shared purpose to create a world that made sense, a world in balance. But in its fall, we also see a warning. Even the greatest systems can break. Climate shifted, wars came, trade routes changed, and the structures that had once seemed eternal were revealed to be vulnerable. Angkor teaches us that even the most beautiful visions must be cared for, not just with stone, but with compassion, with attention, with humility. It reminds us of how easy it is to forget what holds a civilization together, and how slowly that forgetting begins. First the canals dry, then the farmers leave, then the temples fall silent. And yet Angkor
also teaches us this: nothing is ever truly lost. The forest may hide,
the years may cover, but beneath the vines the carvings remain. We live in a world filled with fast change and loud endings. But Angkor speaks softly. It says, build carefully, lead with faith, live in balance, and above all, remember a civilization, remembered in the cool hush of twilight as the sun sinks behind the towers of Angkor Wat. The sky burns orange, then fades to blue. Birds return to the trees, the stone grows cool beneath the touch, and in that stillness we hear the echoes, not of war, not of conquest, but of devotion, of hands shaping stone, of stories told in shadow and flame, of prayers whispered beneath the stars. The Khmer Empire is no longer a living kingdom, but it lives in the ways that matter most. In every line of Khmer script, flowing like the ancient rivers. In every dance that mimics the apsaras on the walls. In every offering left at the foot of a forgotten shrine. In every traveller who stands before the towers, breath held in wonder. Angkor is not just a place, it is a memory carved into the heart of a people, a temple not of bricks but of belief. We end our journey here, not at the end, but at the beginning of understanding. The Khmer Empire may be gone, but its story continues, in stone, in spirit, in silence, and in the soft echo that reminds us. All things sacred may sleep, but they do not forget.